So, a couple of weeks ago, it all happened again. Once again, late movements under brakes from triple world champion Max Verstappen has invoked the ire of many a people in the world of motor racing. Once again, questions are being asked about the racecraft of a dude who is flawless on the climb, but a maniac in defense. And depending upon what flag you fly, this is either an over-exaggeration, a relatively innocent crash that just unfortunately resulted in 2 punches, or something that had been a long time coming after many a time where instances like this went unpunished. So what is it, and where do we go from here? Well, you guys know how my videos go by now. Time to turn back that clock. When Max Verstappen came into the sport in 2015, he was a prodigy that was signed up by the Red Bull family, blah 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 blah. You know how the story goes. Everyone knows the ascent of Max Verstappen, and we all remember what happened the first time he drove in the main Red Bull team, benefiting from the aftermath of the Mercedes Silver War, and holding off a Kimi Raikkonen that was merely sticking around for the ice cream and vodka. I mean, not that you can fault that. We all remember the insane talent on display from Max in the years of his life where most of us had barely graduated from eating mud. He was a commodity, and we did like what we saw from the guy. A generational talent, call it what you want. But while that much was evident, and love him or hate him, he's already a living legend of Formula 1, there was something else that was also well known from day one. His, shall we say, aggression. Multiple times over the course of his sophomore year, Max adopted an approach to defensive driving that could best be described as Max would alter his line under brakes in a bit of defense. This posed significant danger to the car behind, as typically when you're passing someone, you are absolutely committing yourself under brakes. To have someone move in front of you at random could result in either a plane crash or a trip to the grass. Neither are preferable and nor are they fair. Now, by the halfway mark of the 2016 season, many drivers had become sick of this, to the point where they were calling for rule changes to be implemented to stop this from happening. You might be thinking, well, wasn't it already there? Well, while under ruling 20.5 in the FIA sporting regulations, it does state that maneuvers liable to hinder other drivers, such as deliberate crowding of a car beyond the edge of the track or any other abnormal change of direction, are not permitted. A lot of this was left to interpretation. In these cases here, there was no penalty ever issued for it. Now, these kinds of things weren't really something especially unique to Max. It was an endemic problem throughout junior Formula racing, and even in Formula 1, there were already drivers pulling these gymnastics, but it didn't make it right. It had to be stamped out. In response to this, the FIA implemented a rule where they would punish potentially dangerous defensive maneuvers. Great, awesome, problem solved. Roll credits, where's my goddamn cookie? Okay. It didn't last long, didn't it? No. Just a few months later, the rule would be dropped for the 2017 season to allow for more freedom in racing. There would now be a broader rule enforced where any erratic movements would be punished. Also great, and to their credit, we did see a drop-off in these sorts of movements from Max going forward, although they were never fully eradicated. The number one rule in racing is never run into your teammate, but in the spring of 2018, that could have been amended a little bit to never wiggle about in the braking area and cause your teammate to crash into you. This had come at a bad time for Max. He was in a bad run of form, and now he had the entire nation of Australia howling for his blood. Strangely, both drivers were apportioned blame for this and were made to apologize to the entire team. Not that it made much difference. Sorry doesn't cure the car. But after these problematic times, Max adopted a hardline approach to racing, where the limits of what was acceptable were being pushed. And that's what any great racing driver would do. It's what any great sports person would do. There's nothing necessarily wrong with it, but the question is, can you stop yourself when you start to overstep the boundaries? And this was out in force just a couple of years later. For the majority of 2021, we were treated to one of the greatest seasons of Formula 1 ever. 2 absolute titans that we still absolutely do not give enough credit for, going at it hammer and tongs. Red Bull, however it came to be, now had a car that Max could use to challenge the empire of Mercedes and the might of Lewis Hamilton with. But while there were a lot of good moments, hard as nails racing from 2 guys pushing to the absolute limits, while the media and fan bases were engaging in limp-wristed cyber ragegasms, there were other moments that were not so good. Whose fault these crashes were could be left up to interpretation, and I will eventually cover this season in a video once we've all calmed down over it. So I'll see you in October 2054. But there were a couple of races that I will talk about now.
Okay, before we go any further, I just want to acknowledge recent revelations regarding Max's struggles post-Silverstone from his concussion. Those are all serious, and we should be thankful that he's now in better shape, and it might account for some of the things that happened in the second half of 2021. But for these two incidents that I'm about to bring up, I won't be so kind to him. Evidently though, I've got to be a sick man to offer lad here any amount of olive branch.
With 4 rounds to go, the circus arrived in Brazil, and by this time, Lewis was on a wave of form that could only be matched by the engine behind him. Together they formed a behemoth that was pretty much unbeatable. Doesn't matter how good you are, when Lewis and his car are in song, you can't beat that. And although penalties in qualifying meant that he would be starting 10th for the main race, Max knew that he would be right on top of him very soon. And when he was, Max started jumping at shadows. Once again moving in the braking zone, even if it was all a fugazi from Lewis, a feint to set himself up for turn 4, the Terceira do Lago. But when they got there, what happened was rancid. Running Lewis and himself off the track through what Max described as missing his braking marker. Now, there are some things that I'll believe in before that, such as the moon is made of cheese, or Danica Patrick's theory on lizard people. Max has the ability of Gran Turismo's Sophie AI. This was just desperation, and somehow, Max was never punished for this. It didn't really matter at the end of the day, as Lewis sided on through and won the race. But while Max did pick up second, many people looked at him with the air of a kid who just took a crap on the salad bar at Wendy's. That sense of, look, we love you, but please don't do that again, man. However, when it came to misdemeanors, this was nothing. Whatever Max ate on the eve of the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, it obviously didn't do anything to his digestive tract, because in that race, he had no to give. You didn't even need any telemetry to figure out where he was. You just had to follow the blue smoke. And to a point, this was okay, I guess? Maybe a little bit over the edge, but he was racing for a championship, and no one was getting hurt much. So for the first few laps, this was a relatively enjoyable watch. But then it would descend into a farce. Once he had to defend from Lewis, he started to overstep the border. Again, desperation, defending a car and driver combo that was kind of undefendable. And then on lap 37, the inevitable happened. If there are 3 things that I want purged from this world, it would be traffic, Michael Bay films, and as we saw here, DRS hunting. With the DRS being so powerful and the activation line being at the entry to the last corner, both drivers were in a bit of "no, you go first," and resulted in this calamity and one of the most unserious moments in Formula 1 history. I'll say it right now, this was an absolute joke. And while Lewis's part in the DRS hunting does need to be mentioned, Max effectively brake testing Lewis should have been enough to warrant a 1-race ban starting from the next round. And yes, the next round would have been that one. But it would ruin the finale and a great season of racing, and fans would be disappointed. So what? You've got to draw a line in the sand here, irrespective of how much money it's going to lose you in marketing. I mean, all that is, if you want to keep calling yourself a sport. And it sucked, because it was a blemish on Max's record in a season that otherwise proved how he was talented on a level that cannot be quantified with words. And ultimately what happened throughout that year put him at odds with the media and with the British fanbase. Asking the question, why does Max Verstappen race Lewis Hamilton differently? And it definitely wasn't helped when they had another tango at Interlagos just 12 months later. And so everything outlined in the video thus far and more had given Max such a damaged reputation that amongst a certain populace, he will always be labelled a dirty driver. And so we arrive back to the present day, to the most recent incident, the one that happened in Austria. After what looked to be another processional race, a pit stop blunder, as well as a lockup into turn 4, threw Max into the path of a chasing Lando Norris. And once again, the characteristic of moving in the braking zone started to rear its head again. Although, let us remind ourselves, there is no rule explicitly forbidding moving in the braking zone. Not anymore anyway, and it wasn't extreme enough of a movement to even warrant an investigation, so play on, I guess? A few laps go by, and the beginning of the end begins. Lando goes down the inside at turn 3, locks up, and goes off the track, forcing Max off along with him. A move way too optimistic and over the boundaries, but Max eventually did get past again, so hey, all's fair in love and war, I guess. A couple laps later, Lando again attempted the same move. This time he stayed on, but Max booted it into the runoff and swung it ahead. This wasn't so cool from Max, and that on its own should have carried the weight of a penalty, or at least readdress the situation. Because I mean, you can't just drive off the track to regain your position like that. I mean, duh. Then 1 lap later, Lando, in anticipation for the switchback, darted to the outside of Max, who drifted back toward the racing line, leading them to clang wheels, giving the Red Bull an instant puncture, while Lando's car disintegrated like a president.
I can't take it. I can't take this. Go ahead, Max. Go ahead, Max.
This threw Max down to 5th, but more crucially, it threw Lando out of the race. The outcry from this incident has been tremendous. It almost felt like we were back in 2021, with just an orgy of toxicity online from fans and from the media, many of whom screamed from the rooftops that this was proof that Max was a filthy driver and that he had never matured and that he races British drivers differently. But is this really the case? And even here in the recording process, on the other side of the world, I can already hear that big collective yes coming from the British Isles. But seeing as how I ain't British, let's get into it. Max was issued a 10-second penalty for this clash, and by letter of law, it was warranted. If we're apportioning blame, it's definitely on Max. But was it enough of a penalty? Well, these are the rules we live by. If you want to increase the harshness, you have to write that into the rules itself. You can't just shift the goalpost due to the outcome and who the driver is, irrespective of what certain media outlets want to say. That eye for eye mentality is just opening a whole new can of worms. But there is a narrative going around that this was a dirty move. That narrative needs to be checked up. We see crowding like this all the time, from drivers up and down the grid. And while it doesn't make it right, and Max does still deserve the penalty for causing the accident, to call this, and only this, dirty is a mighty strange hill to die on. This was more miscalculation than malicious intent. If this wheel clang didn't result in a puncture for either driver, or more specifically Lando, we would not be talking about this. Banging wheels is part of what makes some of the great racing we know. This was just unlucky. The outrage is in the outcome, not the act itself. If there is something you can sink your teeth into, it was the movement in the braking zones, that run wide to keep his place on the second overtake attempt, and the block put on after the crash. All that stuff was rancid, and Max does need to be called out on it, but it also just seemed so unnecessary because Lando was about to be pinged for track limits anyway, so Red Bull could have instructed Max to just let Lando go, hang on to his coattails, and pick up the win by default, so long as he stayed within 5 seconds of his fellow Belgian. Then again, Max should have been pinged for his NASCAR line a lap prior, but I guess that more speaks to the inconsistent stewarding. Can nobody do anything right? Now, in the midst of recording this video, it's since come out that Lando and Max seem to have some common ground about the fact that this incident was merely an incident, that's motor racing. Happens. However, the damage had already been done, and even throughout the course of the British Grand Prix weekend, there was still speculation of will he pull this stuff again, trying to suggest that this guy was intentionally looking for trouble. All those journalists and pundits that contributed to that, and you guys know who you are. In a time where mental health is supposedly held to utmost importance, you guys need to do better and stop creating something out of nothing just for clicks and clout. Not every incident needs an antagonist. This ain't Drive to Survive, for God's sake, this is the real world. But with it being the real world, Austria did expose some legitimate concerns about Max's approach to defensive driving. Tempers flew high in the McLaren camp afterwards, and understandably so. Team principal Andrea Stella commented that if you don't address these things honestly, they will come back, because they were not addressed properly in the past when there were some fights with Lewis that needed to be punished in a harsher way. To which he raises a good point. There were things that happened in 2021 that I mentioned, where Max deserved to be dipped in brown gravy and thrown into a bear enclosure. And while, yeah, this was a fairly innocuous clash through hard racing that just had an unfortunate end, the re-emerging traits of moving in the braking zone and retaking his positions via running out into Chachia is a problem. That is the problem of Max Verstappen, the one chink in the armor. Now, look, this video is not meant to be a hit piece against Max. The check from McLaren has not yet cleared, but this particular problem impacts drivers around him, rather than the case of Ferrari, for instance, who only seem to affect themselves. Was this whole Austria thing an overreaction? Well, yeah. Kinda. People do need to calm down a bit with Max here. I mean, he's not the devil for crying out loud. No, that guy currently lives in Brazil. No racing driver that has ever lived has ever been perfect, but a large part of the outcry is a consequence of the reputation that he built himself of when he goes beyond the edge. And that stuff is still there when it really shouldn't be. And herein lies the dilemma. At the end of the day, we shouldn't look to inhibit Max from racing as hard as he does, because that's freaking motor racing, and it's a marvel to watch. And frankly, we're not going to know until too late just how lucky we are to witness this guy live and in living color. All the good stuff about him is great, and there's a lot of it, but the one thing that must stop is overstepping the boundary. In a very basic sense, Maximilian Verstappen, please, don't be a Manus.